I spent 30 years carving a life out of the jagged mountains, building a timber empire that provided for every soul in our valley. But my own son saw me as nothing more than a lock standing between him and a fortune. He led me into the deepest, darkest part of an abandoned mine under the guise of a business venture, only to trigger a collapse and leave me to rot in the cold earth. Caleb thought the mountain would be my tomb and that he could finally sit on the throne he didn't earn. But he forgot that I'm the one who taught him how to walk through the dark. I am back now, a shadow crawling out of the grave, and I won't stop until he feels the weight of every stone he tried to bury me under. This is the story of a father's love turned into a cold, sharp blade of vengeance. My name is Elias Thorne. In this valley, my name used to mean something. It meant hard work, a fair wage, and a handshake that was as solid as the oak trees we harvested. I started with nothing but a rusted axe and a pair of boots that had holes in the soles. I spent my youth sweating through shirts and freezing through winters to build Thorne timber. I didn't do it for the money, not really. I did it because I wanted to build something that would last. I wanted to leave a legacy for my son, Caleb. I remember holding him when he was a baby, looking at his small hands, and thinking that one day, those hands would carry the weight of everything I had built. I thought I was being a good father by giving him the world on a silver platter. I thought that by shielding him from the hunger and the cold I had faced, I was making his life better. I was wrong. I wasn't protecting him. I was making him soft, and worse, I was making him greedy. As Caleb grew older, the fire in his eyes wasn't the fire of a worker. It was the flicker of a predator. He didn't care about the smell of fresh-cut pine or the sound of the river that powered our mills. He only cared about the numbers in the ledger. He started talking about expanding and optimizing, which was just his way of saying he wanted to fire the men who had been with me for 20 years just to save a few dollars. I told him no. I told him that a company is only as good as the people who build it. He looked at me that day with a coldness that should have chilled my blood, but I was blinded by a father's hope. I thought he was just young and impulsive. I didn't realize he was already planning my funeral. It happened on a gray, misty morning in late November. The air was so cold it felt like needles against your skin. Caleb came in my office at the mill, a blueprint rolled up under his arm. He looked excited, more than I'd seen him in years. He told me he'd found a vein of rare minerals in the old North Mine, a part of the mountain we'd closed off decades ago because the ground was too unstable. He said that if we could verify the find, the company would be worth 10 times what it was now. He didn't want to send a crew yet. He wanted it to be a secret. Just father and son, one last scout before we went public. I was 60 years old, and my knees were starting to ache, but the idea of one last adventure with my boy was too much to turn down. I grabbed my lantern and my coat, and we headed up the mountain. The North Mine was a jagged mouth in the side of the cliff, overgrown with weeds and smelling of damp earth and ancient silence. As we stepped inside, the light of the sun vanished, replaced by the flickering orange glow of our lamps. The air was thick and tasted of dust. We walked for nearly an hour, deeper and deeper into the belly of the mountain. Caleb led the way, his footsteps echoing off the wet walls. I started to get an uneasy feeling. The timber supports were rotted, hanging like broken ribs. I told him we should turn back, that the air was getting thin. He stopped and turned around, his lamp casting long, distorted shadows on the rock. "Just a little further, Dad," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the excitement he'd shown earlier. "The vein is right behind the old blasting wall." We reached a narrow tunnel that ended in a wall of loose shale. I leaned in to look, my back turned to my son. I was searching for a glimmer of silver or gold, something to justify the trip. That's when I heard it, a metallic click. I turned around and saw Caleb standing by one of the main support beams. He was holding a small remote detonator. My heart stopped. I looked at the beam and saw the small professional-grade explosives he had rigged while I was looking at the wall. "Caleb," I whispered, "what are you doing?" "You're too slow, Elias," he said. He didn't call me Dad. He called me by my name. "You're an old man holding on to an old world. The board is ready to sell. The developers are waiting, but they won't sign as long as you're alive to veto the deal. You're the anchor that's drowning us both. I gave you everything. I gasped, the cold of the mind finally seeping into my heart. You gave me a cage, he snapped. You gave me your rules and your honor. I don't want your honor. I want your money. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the button. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was deep. It felt like the mountain itself was groaning in pain. The ceiling above us shattered. I tried to run toward him, but a massive slab of rock fell between us, pinning my leg and throwing me into the darkness. I heard the sound of more rocks falling, a thunderous roar that seemed to go on forever. When the dust finally settled, there was no light, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I screamed for him. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the drip of water somewhere in the deep. My son was gone, and he had buried me alive. I lay there for hours, maybe days. The pain in my leg was a white-hot scream that eventually faded into a dull, throbbing numbness. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical weight that pressed against my chest. I thought about giving up. I thought about closing my eyes and letting the cold take me. I thought about the life I'd lived and how it was all going to end in this lonely hole. But then I heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was the sound of a wood chipper, miles away, echoing through a small fissure in the rock. It was the sound of my mill, my life's work. And I knew that Caleb was down there, sitting in my chair, drinking my whiskey, and telling everyone that his father had died in a tragic accident. That thought did what the cold couldn't. It lit a fire in me, a cold, black fire of rage. I reached out and felt the rocks. My hands were shredded and bloody, but I didn't care. I started to dig. I didn't have a shovel or a pickaxe. I had my fingernails and my teeth. I pushed against the slab that held my leg, screaming in agony as the bone ground against the stone. I pulled and I pushed until finally, with a sickening pop, my leg came free. I couldn't walk, so I crawled. I crawled through tunnels that were barely wider than my shoulders. I followed the faint movement of air, the smell of damp pine that occasionally drifted through the cracks. I ate bugs. I licked the moisture off the walls. I became something less than human, a creature of the dark driven by a single, pulsing need to see my son's face when I came back from the dead. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button to catch more stories like this, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I'll love to hear. After what felt like a lifetime, I saw a sliver of gray. It was so bright it felt like a needle in my eye. I clawed my way toward it, my fingers raw to the bone. I pushed through a wall of loose scree and tumbled out onto the mountainside. I lay there in the freezing rain, gasping for air, the light of a winter afternoon blinding me. I looked down at my hands. They were black with dirt and dry blood. My clothes were rags. I looked like a monster. I dragged myself to a small stream and looked at my reflection. My hair had turned white, and my face was gaunt, my eyes sunken and glowing with a feverish intensity. I didn't recognize myself, and that was my greatest advantage. I didn't go into town right away. I knew Caleb would have guards of the house and the mill. He would have told the police I was gone. If I showed up now, he'd just finish the job. No, I had to be a ghost. I spent the next 2 weeks in an old trapper's cabin deep in the woods, a place I'd built years ago that even Caleb didn't know about. I healed my leg with makeshift splints and mountain herbs. I hunted with snares. I watched the town from the ridge. I saw the funeral. It was a massive affair. Caleb had spared no expense, using my money to buy the most expensive casket for an empty grave. I watched through a pair of old binoculars as he stood at the podium, wiping away fake tears as he spoke about his heroic father. I saw the way he hugged the mourners, the way he played the part of the grieving son to perfection. The rage inside me grew until it felt like it would burst out of my chest. He was wearing my watch. He was living in my house. He was erasing me. I decided that killing him wasn't enough. A bullet or a blade was too quick. He had taken my life piece by piece, so I was going to do the same to him. I was going to make him lose his mind before he lost his life. I started small. Caleb was a man of habit. He liked to go to the office early, and he liked to have a drink at the local tavern on Friday nights to show the workers he was one of them. The first thing I did was visit the mill at night. I knew every gear, every belt, every secret of that place. I didn't break anything. I just adjusted things. I loosened a bolt here, tightened a tension wire there. The next morning, the main saw jammed 3 times. The production line stalled. The men started whispering. Then I went to the house. I let myself in through the cellar. I knew the floorboards that didn't creak. I went into his study, my old study, and I moved things just an inch. I moved his pen from the right side of the desk to the left. I changed the time on his desk clock by 5 minutes. I took one single cufflink from his drawer, small things that nagged at the back of his mind. I wanted him to feel like the world was slipping out of his control. One night, I waited until he was asleep. I stood in the corner of his bedroom, a shadow among shadows. I watched him sleep in the bed I had shared with his mother. He looked so peaceful, so arrogant. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of shale from the North Mine. I placed it on his nightstand, right next to his glass of water. The next morning, I watched from the trees as he left the house. He looked pale. His movements were jerky. He kept looking over his shoulder. He was starting to feel it. He was starting to realize that the mountain hadn't kept its secret. I followed him to the mill. He was in a rage, screaming at the foreman because the output was down. He looked like a man who was losing his grip. I slipped into the shadows of the warehouse and waited for him to walk by. As he passed a stack of lumber, I whispered one word, just loud enough for him to hear. Caleb. He spun around, his face white. Who's there? He shouted. Who said that? The foreman ran over. What is it, Mr. Thorne? Someone called my name. Caleb hissed, his eyes darting around the dark corners of the warehouse. I heard it. There's nobody here but us, sir, the foreman said, looking at him with concern. Caleb didn't stay. He ran to his car and drove back to the house. He spent the rest of the day locked in the study, drinking heavily. I knew because I was under the floorboards, listening to the clinking of the glass and the frantic scratching of his pen. He was trying to figure out what was happening. He was trying to convince himself that he was just tired, that his guilt was playing tricks on him. But I wasn't done. I went to the tavern that night. I wore a heavy hood and sat in the darkest corner. Caleb came in an hour later, looking like a wreck. He ordered a double whiskey and sat by himself. The workers gave him a wide berth. The rumors of his breakdown at the mill had already spread. I waited until he was on his 3rd drink. Then I got up and walked past him. As I passed, I dropped a small, muddy button onto his table. It was the button from the coat I was wearing the day he blew the mine. He picked it up, his hand trembling so hard the whiskey spilled. He looked at it. Then he looked up, trying to find the man who had dropped it. But I was already gone, out into the cold night air. I heard him scream inside the tavern, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He fled back to the house and called the police. I watched from the ridge as the squad cars pulled up. They searched the grounds. They searched the house, but they found nothing. I was a ghost, and you can't catch a ghost. After the police left, Caleb started boarding up the windows. He was trapping himself in his own cage. He thought he was keeping me out, but he didn't realize I was already inside. I was the whisper in the walls, the creak in the floor, the cold breeze that blew through a locked room. I went back to the trapper's cabin that night. My leg was aching, and my body was exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The plan was working. Caleb was falling apart, but the best part was yet to come. I wasn't just going to drive him mad. I was going to take back everything he had stolen, and I was going to make sure that the whole town saw the monster he really was. The next day was the day of the board meeting, the day he was supposed to sign the papers to sell the company and the mountain to the developers. He had invited them all to the house for a private signing. It was going to be his greatest triumph. He thought he was going to walk away with millions, leaving the valley and the people behind. But I had a different plan for the meeting. I had one final secret to reveal, a secret that would bring his whole world crashing down. I spent the morning gathering the last of the evidence I needed. I went back to the North Mine, Not inside, but to the area around the entrance. I found the discarded blasting caps and a receipt for the explosives he had bought under a fake name. I found his discarded gloves, still stained with the dust of the explosion. I was ready. I waited for the sun to go down and the lights to go on in the Thorne mansion. I could see the men in suits arriving, their expensive cars lining the driveway. I could see Caleb at the window, trying to look composed, but I could see the way he kept glancing at the shadows. He knew I was out there. He could feel the mountain watching him. I slipped into the house through the cellar one last time. I moved up through the walls, listening to the sounds of the meeting in the dining room. "Everything is in order, Mr. Thorne," one of the lawyers said. "Once you sign here, the fund will be transferred, and the mountain will be ours." "Good," Caleb said. His voice was shaky, but he was trying to sound firm. "Let's get this over with." I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. I didn't hide my face. I didn't hide my scars. I stood there in the light of the chandelier, a ghost in rags, looking directly at my son. "The deal is off, Caleb," I said. The room went silent. The lawyers froze. The developers stared. Caleb dropped the pen, his eyes bulging as if they were about to pop out his head. He tried to speak, but only a wet, choking sound came out. "Elias," one of the board members whispered, standing up. "Is that really you?" "It's me," I said, stepping into the center of the room. "And I'm here to tell you about the accident in the North Mine." Caleb finally found his voice. "It's an imposter," he screamed, his face turning a sickly shade of purple. "It's a crazy man. Guards, get him out of here." But nobody moved. They were all looking at me, then at the evidence I was holding in my shredded, bloody hands. They saw the truth in my eyes, and they saw the guilt in his. The game was over. The hunter had become the prey. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of his nightmare. Because as the police sirens began to wail in the distance once again, I leaned in and whispered into Caleb's ear, loud enough for only him to hear. "The mountain remembers everything, son. And now the world does too."